Hello, welcome. My name is Steve Hewitt. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Birmingham. I run this Twitter account called Terrorizing History. And today we are joined by an amazing guest, Professor Richard English, a professor of politics, and also Pro Vice Chancellor for International. Is that right? At Queen's University, Belfast. He's in Belfast. He's the author of several brilliant books related to terrorism, the past and present, including armed struggle, the history of the IRA, terrorism, how to respond, and does terrorism work? And he's the editor of this brand new book, which I have a copy of, called The Cambridge History of Terrorism. And so he's here today to talk to us about the writing of the history of terrorism and also about this new book on terrorism. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Steve. Looking forward to talking with you.
So tell us, how did you get interested in the subject of terrorism in the first place?
For once, it's my mother's fault. So I was born in Belfast, and despite my accent, I grew up in England, but despite my accent, I've therefore got a partly Belfast and Irish background. And during my childhood, we used to come across to Northern Ireland particularly, but to other parts of Ireland. And this would have been in the late 60s, early 1970s, when terrorism and responses to terrorism and soldiers on the streets were becoming tragically the norm. And then when I was a student at Oxford, I was interested in the tension between nationalism and Marxism and how they related or didn't relate to each other. And I needed a case study. And because of the background, being born in Belfast, going back and forward, having an interest in the IRA and responses to them, I chose the Irish case study and worked on that for my PhD, and then got hooked, came and worked at Queen's University in 1989. And it's been a wonderful place. I've worked most of my career at Queen's University, Belfast. It's been a great place to study these things and to teach them. And so I suppose it was partly because of a family twist, but also in some ways I've always thought that terrorism isn't the really important thing. Terrorism is a symptom of the really important things. And so my introduction to it was looking at the ways in which nationalism and Marxism were in conflict in the 1980s for many activists and movements. And the IRA's experience of leftism as against Irish nationalism was a case study of that. So in some ways, I suppose the origins of my own interest mirror something which I think to be important in the understanding of terrorism, that it's the really major phenomena, nationalisms, the state, religiously fueled ideologies and so forth, and how they relate to each other, which we probably should mostly focus on, rather than the awful bloodstained violence that terrorism involves.
And how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a historian? Do you see yourself, I mean, you're a professor of politics. I mean, if you had to categorize yourself.
If I had to characterize myself, I suppose political historian. I mean, my job at Queen's is as professor of politics, but my degrees are in history. I have worked all my career actually in politics and international relations schools, and I've found that a privilege. The approach to these disciplinary boundaries varies, doesn't it, geographically? I found that both in Belfast and in St Andrews, where I worked for a time, there was a pluralistic definition of what the study of politics or international relations involved, which allowed for an historian like myself to be involved in a way that studied political things with a longer historical route to it. But maybe I feel some of the history that I've written has benefited from having a sharp contemporary edge to it. And in the city from where I was speaking to you in Belfast, politics and history are close relatives, so it's very difficult to do the one without the echoes of the other. So I feel it's been a kind of dual disciplinary benefit, although I also think that there are sometimes challenges in that people tend to think interdisciplinarity is a great thing until you get to something like the ref or something in the UK. In other words, quite often then people go back into disciplinary silos. But personally, I think that for all of the distinctive value of each discipline, dialogue between them is really fruitful. And on terrorism, I think that's certainly the case.
And it's not a case that you don't feel at home in, say, history departments. I asked that because I once had a chat with, I don't know if you know Richard Aldrich, who, so Richard's in a politics department at Warwick, but he's a historian. And he felt like he didn't really have a home anymore in history departments, in the sense that he wanted to do different questions than historians were asking. But I mean,
I haven't felt that. I mean, Richard's a brilliant scholar, and I can understand how he might feel about that. But my own view has been that I've actually felt both that I've always been welcome in history departments. So quite often when I'm invited to do lectures, it's in history settings by historians. But also I think some of the historiographical trends have moved towards the political in some ways. So I think some of the identity related historical work that's been done very powerfully in recent years is something which is very recognizable to someone who for a long time has been working in a politics department or a politics school. And I suppose all of our bibliographies now are to some degree transgressive of disciplinary boundaries. So I've always felt at home in these departments. Though, I mean, as the book, The Cambridge History of Terrorism, reflects, I still very much think that history as such, or historically minded scholarship as such, has something distinctive to offer, has a particular voice, which I would see as being complementary to the other disciplines, I think each of which has equally precious insights.
So in that book, The Cambridge History of Terrorism, you have an excellent introduction where you point out the underrepresentation of historians in the past and present when it comes to the study of terrorism. I mean, you run through the statistics in terms of journals and also centers where terrorism is studied, that they're not based in history departments, even if historians are sometimes involved in them. How do you explain the gap, the underrepresentation, not only in the present, but obviously historically as well?
Yeah, it's a puzzle, and my answer to it may not persuade people, but my answer to it, I suppose, is that the things that make an historical approach, in my view, distinctive are also things that might make it more difficult both for historians to get involved and for people to listen to them. So, for example, much debate on terrorism and responses to terrorism focuses very much on the present. So there's a kind of solipsism of the present about how we respond. Mm-hmm. So everything about Al-Qaeda, then everything about ISIS, or everything about right-wing terrorism. Whereas one of the distinctive things historians bring is a consideration of the relationship between continuity and change over long pasts, and that therefore is something which may seem not all that comfortable. Again, I think historians, there's enormous variety of historical approaches clearly, but historians tend to focus emphatically on the complex particularity and ultimately the uniqueness of each context. And while I think that allows for comparison and family resemblances, it also, like historians' frequent skepticism about inevitability and preference for contingency, makes it more difficult to get predictions. So it's not easy to say because this happened with the IRA, therefore it will happen with Hamas, or because this happened with the FARC, therefore it will happen with ISIS. I think there are cross-referencing family resemblances, as I've mentioned, but I think quite often in responses to terrorism, people want you to say, particularly for policy purposes, if you get A, B, and C, you're going to get D, and therefore you can predict it. Again, I think historians tend to be very skeptical about what my PhD supervisor, Charles Townsend, would have called overly mechanistic theories. In other words, theories which apply a certain rigidity to human explanation. Historians tend to say, well, it's always multi-causal and it's always murky and jagged and all the rest of it. Whereas quite often, particularly in the grip of a crisis, quite understandably, perhaps citizens, governments, police forces want you to say, here's a theory which explains why this terrible thing is happening, and here's a theory which explains what we can do about it. So I suppose my argument, Steve, is that some of the things which I think are particularly valuable also make it less likely that historians might have felt comfortable in some of those debates. Less likely, perhaps, that some of the funding might automatically have gone to them. It's also, I think, something where quite often, if historians like myself would see the main thing is trying to explain what people have done, why they've done it, and what the consequences are, there's a tendency, therefore, to be slightly skeptical about the it's us against them, or it's an attempt to undermine an opponent. And I think it's entirely understandable that when people think about terrorism, they see it as something which needs to be extirpated or combated. On the other hand, if what you're saying, as if my work on the IRA, whose violence I never endorsed and never thought to be justified, but was practiced by very normal people for very understandable reasons in an awful set of circumstances, as I say, not justifiable, but I think explicable, not always comfortable to turn up in policy circles and say that, because people don't want necessarily to think about it like that. But I think historians' instinctive territory is that. So my sense is there's a paradox of something distinctive to bring, which makes it more difficult for you to bring it or to feel comfortable doing it. I hope that's beginning to change. Part of the reason for engaging in this book and getting excellent scholars like yourself to contribute to it is to put a big marker down about that which can be understood historically in distinctive ways, not because it's better than other disciplines, but to complement them. And I hope there'll be an historical orientation, because I think there is a difficulty with approaching the subject, whether as academics or as people who are in the policy world when they're facing it, in an amnesiac way. And I think thinking in long-term ways is probably helpful.
I was thinking of that in the context of the lack of historical memory in institutions and among policymakers. I once had a member of the local counterterrorism unit come to speak to my history of terrorism module. And afterwards we were chatting and I was saying about how relevant I thought that some past terrorism was to the president. And he shook his head and said, no, we can't, the IRA has nothing to compare to what's happening now. And I was thinking of 19th century anarchists actually, but his time frame was much shorter. And the other thing I think about historians is often I think this focus on the present is a snapshot. And when you have a snapshot, certain groups become overrepresented and then face the kind of backlash that we've seen. Whereas if you have a wider portrait, many people, many different groups, faiths have blood on their hands if you take it back far enough. And I think historians, in some ways, we could help in the public arena by sort of reducing the sense of this uniqueness of the present by looking at the longer history.
I would totally agree with that. And I think a lot of blood has been avoidably spilt because that hasn't happened. And I think the sense that whatever challenge we face now is utterly different from everything before means that you miss the possibilities that there might be not, I think, neat lessons, but deep intuitions born on prior understanding. So it seems to me that for all of the profound differences between the IRA and Al-Qaeda, or indeed Al-Qaeda and ISIS, it seems to me that some aspects of how effective counterterrorism is done, the thinking about root causes, the realistic nature of what you can and can't achieve, the avoidance of over-militarization, the need for credibility and argument for coordination of response. Those things seem to me to be equally relevant if you're facing the post-9/11 threat as if you were facing a 1970s threat in Belfast, or the sort of threat that Israel has faced from Palestinian terrorism and so forth. So while I think all terrorisms are unique, it doesn't mean they don't have some kind of echoes. I mean, all humans are unique, but that doesn't mean that when there's a medical condition, you ignore the family resemblances that might be relevant when you're looking at aspects of response. And I would think historians are well placed to do that. And as you imply, Steve, I think it's also the case that if you look at where the origins of terroristic violence come from, few people emerge with an entirely clean slate. And I think some sort of humility, therefore, about the violence practiced in the name of whatever one's own community is, can be a partial dilution of some of the more egregious over responses and demonizations and binary approaches to things. So I would rather read the history as a way of our getting a more empathetic and humble, and therefore I think more effective way of dealing with what is obviously a bloodstained and merciless phenomenon.
There's an irony in the sense that in some ways, I feel like history has never been more important. I mean, you know, that all the debates that have been going on about statues and memorials and Cecil Rhodes. I was out on the bank holiday Monday. I did a long run and I listened to the Today program, the whole Today program, and it was from Northern Ireland because it was the 100th anniversary of the creation of Northern Ireland. They had local historians on, but also, strangely, it often seems historians are absent, at least professional historians. And you talk in the chapter in your introduction about public historians and how they're often, looked down upon. But I'm wondering how much historians, professional ones, we are to blame in a sense for not sort of engaging in some of these debates and hiving ourselves off into the stereotypical ivory tower.
Yeah, I think that, as one of my lastingly favourite historians, Eric Hobsbawm, put it, history is too important to be written only for historians. I think that there is clearly a kind of specialist debate which will be a hardcore taste, and I think that's something which won't ever fill the airwaves or the bookshops in large numbers. On the other hand, I think quite often topics, including clearly terrorism, have a very strong public interest, and there is a very strong public need for some kind of historical information. I myself don't look down on public historians. I think that they contribute to debate in a way which makes the subject more interesting to more people and raises big questions. And I think that some of that has become, as you say, even more valuable around the Black Lives Matter arguments around present and past. I think it's crucial that there is proper historical discussion. I think it's even more pressing in a period when, for all of its merits, Twitter and such forms have become the mode of argument, because I think that's necessarily episodic and brief rather than a concatenated long argument. And I think it's often polarizing and somewhat abusive. And the fact that people can do it anonymously means that people can get it to say things they wouldn't say if they were face to face. And I think, therefore, what historians could do is also say, some kind of context needs to be brought to our reflection, whether it's on statues and legacies, divided societies. The 100th anniversary of the partitioning of Ireland and the founding of Northern Ireland is a very good example. I mean, here at Queen's, we've tried to do some work on that with historians and other scholars, but mainly historians, I'd have to say, engaging in some kind of public reflections from all sides. It doesn't solve problems, but I think it does offer a resource. And I think sometimes it can also make sure that some kind of certainties are re-examined. At least I think history does. I don't think it means that you'll change your politics, but I think it might mean that you have a richer understanding of why those with whom you disagree have got to where they are. And I think that probably in the examples you're talking about would be a helpful condition, and historians can contribute to that, I think.
Tell us about the book, The Cambridge History of Terrorism.
So the Cambridge History of Terrorism is a multi-authored volume. It looks at various case studies geographically. Those chapters mostly written by people who reside in them or who have long been resident in them. So chapters on Pakistan, on Russia, on the Netherlands, on Ireland, on the Basque Country, on the USA, various case studies, all of them rich and all of them historical, and looking at the complexity of causation and consequence, and also looking, as you say, at the fact that there are many different origins. So people, for example, the chapter by Dr. Dayab Gilani about Pakistan, which points out that while much attention to terrorism in Pakistan is around jihadist terrorism, issues of nationalism, of state formation, of state behavior are also crucial in that context. We also then look at some key themes, and you've got an excellent chapter in the book on counterterrorism, where I think, as you say, the histories of counterterrorism need to go further, even more than the histories of terrorism. In a sense, there's been less work on that, even though counterterrorism probably has changed history more than terrorism, I think. There are questions of periodization addressed, the idea of when you can start meaningfully talking about terrorism. And a chapter by Warren Brown about periodization looks very valuably, I think, at the idea that one way of understanding the usefulness of the word terrorism is to allow it to be a lens through which you see how various people viewed the world or didn't view the world, and trying to avoid anachronism. And then there are various different assessments in terms of things like the religion and nationalism, religion and international connections and so forth. Sorry, terrorism and international connections, and religion, terrorism and nationalism. So it's a wide-ranging volume. I think all of the chapters are ones which people will find really compelling, whether they're historians or not. Most of the authors are historians, all of them thinking historically minded. And I feel that the book has a kind of centripetal rather than centrifugal quality. You can see in the book people referencing each other's work. There was a very valuable workshop here at Queen's, which you attended, Steve, where we discussed early versions of the papers. And that meant that there was a kind of conversation and dialogue to the book, which I think is not always the case with edited volumes. So I hope people, historians or others, will find it useful. I hope they'll continue to find it useful. It's not attempting to say that political science or international relations or economics or psychology have less to say. It is a book which tries to say there are distinctive things that historians and historically minded analysis can bring. I hope that it provokes debate. It's not intended to close it down, but rather to generate it. And I hope that it's something which people will find, whether they're students, scholars, journalists, policymakers, members of the broader community, of interest, and look forward to hearing people's responses to it, because I think it's always the audience and the reader that's more important than the author.
And how about you? What are your future plans? What are you working on at the moment?
So, as you mentioned, Steve, my last book was a book called Does Terrorism Work? And I'm now writing a sibling volume called Does Counterterrorism Work? Which is probably going to annoy even more people, I suspect, but I'm enjoying doing that. One of the things in my conclusion to the Cambridge History of Terrorism is to look at what can historians do next. And I do think the efficacy of terrorism has been something which now has been addressed by a shelf of books and articles, and I think helpfully. But I think the efficacy of counterterrorism is something which is of even greater global significance. I do think that responses to terrorism have affected and changed the world more than non-state terrorism has. And I think that therefore thinking about the efficacy of it and what's involved in it, and one of the things I'm looking at is there's obviously for many actors more going on in counterterrorism than just countering terrorism. There are various kinds of inherent rewards, as I would call them, that you can get, and various kinds of secondary goals that you can get. Being honest about that won't necessarily make me particularly popular, but I'm an old man, so I'm beyond hopes of popularity. But what I do hope with the Does Counterterrorism Work project, as with the Cambridge History of Terrorism, is that historically minded scholarship can feed into wider discussions, wider reflections, and to the extent that it's of interest and that it provokes other people to come up with better arguments, better ideas, I'll feel that it's been worth doing.
That's great. Thank you so much. And again, the book is The Cambridge History of Terrorism. If you're at a university, order it for your bookstore, for your library, and yeah, take it. It's a really thoughtful and very important contribution to the field. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Steve. Enjoyed the conversation.